Hello, and welcome to the JCC of Metro Detroit's 2021 Lenore Marwell Detroit Jewish Film Festival. I'm Judy Lobel, and I'm the Assistant Executive Director of the Jewish Community Center. We are broadcasting live today, Wednesday evening, May 12th, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you. While you're here at our YouTube channel, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click the reminder bell. That way, you will never miss any of our exciting events. The Detroit Jewish Film Festival celebrates the art of Jewish filmmaking by presenting films, encouraging discussions about Jewish stories, and creating shared experiences with filmmakers and audiences around the world. The festival runs until May 23rd, and we have an exceptional lineup of films and events planned. For all the details on how to join the fun, visit our website, which should be listed. It's not there yet, but will be listed at culturalarts.jccdet.org/filmfest. It's not too late to become a patron of Film Festival and get a festival pass. All the festival passes include access to all of our films, as well as exclusive content not available to the public. And there's the website. We hope you'll consider supporting the festival and being part of all the action. So you can become a patron at our website listed on the screen. I want to extend our deepest gratitude to our Film Festival Committee Chair, Eric Lumberg, and the whole Film Festival Committee that works throughout the year to pick the best films to present to you each year. This has been a challenging year, and your dedication, commitment, and hard work have made this an exciting festival. We have a really exciting discussion planned, and we want you to be a part of it. If you are with us live today on May 12th, you can ask questions and offer comments in the YouTube comments section below, or by texting the number in the corner of your screen. Our speakers will take as many questions as they can. Tonight, we will be talking about Léon Blum, who is the center of the story of the film An Irrepressible Woman. The film, which is based on a true story, follows mostly Jean Reichenbach, who eventually becomes his wife, in her attempts to keep track of him and be with him during the war. So tonight we're going to focus on the historical content in which the film is set, and the background of how and why France ended up with a Jewish prime minister in the 1930s. To help us through this confusing historical time, we have with us my friend, Professor Howard Lupovitch, who's been a great friend to the JCC. He's the director of Cohn-Haddow Center for Judaic Studies at Wayne State University. Professor Lupovitch is an expert in the history of Jews in Western and Middle Europe, and a great friend of the Cultural Arts Department at the JCC, and one of our most popular instructors for JLearn. Another very longtime friend of mine, Elliot Wilhelm, will be guiding our discussion. He is the curator and director of the Detroit Film Theater and part-time faculty member at Wayne State University. And Elliot is one of the deans of the Southwest Michigan film scene and a member of our Film Festival Committee. Please join us in welcoming Professor Howard Lupovitch and Elliot Wilhelm.
Well, thank you, Judy.
Thank you.
It's nice to see you. And congratulations on another great festival. I've seen a number of the films this year, not all. I plan to try and get as many in as I possibly can. But certainly have seen the film that we're going to be talking about tonight, known as An Irrepressible Woman in the United States. The film is interesting cinematically, but it's far more interesting, I think, in terms of the history and the characters who are depicted in the film. A lot of folks don't know all of the details of the story, and I'm interested in exploring those further with you, Howard, and also to get a sense of whether you think the movie does, I shouldn't really say necessarily justice to the subject, but portrays it in an accurate light. in terms of history. But to set us off, talk a little bit, if you could, about the Reichenbachs and about Léon Blum. Very interesting figures.
Well, let me say a word. Hello, everybody. It's good. I'm glad you're here. It's always a pleasure to work with Elliot again, and of course, work with the film festival again. And thank you, Judy, and thank you, Jamie, for inviting me. And again, congratulations, another great film festival. So let me say a word or two about the Reichenbachs and Léon Blum together, and then a few more specifically about Léon Blum, because he's really the interesting story here. The Reichenbachs and Léon Blum, these are French Jews who came of age at a time when French Jewry was really reaching its peak in the 1920s and the 1930s. They're highly acculturated. They're very French. These are French people of the Jewish persuasion. They're deeply immersed. And Léon Blum in particular, to put it a little bit more broadly, that they consider themselves, I mean, many Jews of that generation consider themselves really the children of the French Revolution. And I mean the French Revolution of 1789, because they considered themselves products of and beneficiaries of the central ideas that made France a republic, both in 1789 and in the 20th century. Notions of civic equality for all, careers open to talent, separation of religion and state, individual rights, the fact that of one's religion being something private and something voluntary, all of those things, the Reichenbachs and Léon Blum, they saw themselves as being really created by that. Now, Léon Blum specifically, he's a very interesting story. He was born in 1872. He was born to a family of Jews that came from an area of France known as Alsace-Lorraine. Now, if you look at a map of old France, or even today, Alsace-Lorraine, these are the two easternmost provinces of France. These are the two provinces of France that border Germany. And long story short, this area, this border province between France and Germany has been passed back and forth between France and Germany since the time of Charlemagne. I mean, it's an area that both France and Germany sees as part of itself. It has been a contested border zone for centuries. And the last switch until 1871, it belonged to France. It had belonged to France since 1648. In 1871, France lost a war to Germany known as the Franco-Prussian War, and France was forced to cede Alsace-Lorraine to Germany, which means thereafter in France, people in general who came from Alsace-Lorraine were living elsewhere in France. Let's say they were living in Paris, like the Reichenbachs and Léon Blum. But if you came from Alsace-Lorraine, you were automatically suspected of being a spy. Other French people would attribute people from Alsace-Lorraine as they would think of them as a kind of fifth column. Your lack of patriotism and your clandestine loyalty to Germany is the reason why France lost this humiliating war. Now, that's many, many years before this movie takes place. But that attitude towards Alsace-Lorraine, and especially towards Jews who came from Alsace-Lorraine. And this goes to an important element of French politics, which is also going to be very much at the heart of the Léon Blum story, and the Reichenbachs for that matter. You know, France has this revolution in 1789. I'll tell you I'll explain to you the significance of that revolution for France with one little story. In 1989, on the bicentennial of the French Revolution, there were celebrations in France like you wouldn't believe. It puts our bicentennial to shame. 1776 in America was nothing like 1789 in France. But at the same time, all these celebrations were going on in Paris, in France in 1789. There were also French families who were mourning, who were lamenting the revolution. Since 1789, French politics has had a kind of schizophrenia where there are many, maybe the majority of French people revere the revolution and the republic it created as something, not only something almost sacred in a secular way, but there's also been a kind of countercurrent, an anti-republican countercurrent. Now, this anti-republican countercurrent was really the matrix out of which not only anti-republicanism came from, but also anti-Semitism. For those who believed in the Republic, Jews were the exemplar of equality in France. For those who objected to the Republic, who felt that France was maligned by the French Revolution, Jews were the quintessential adversaries and villains. So Léon Blum comes from this family in 1872. The formative experience of his early life came when he was a young man. When he was 22, he witnessed the Dreyfus Affair. Now, you may not realize how Dreyfus and Léon Blum were related, but Dreyfus also came from a family that came from Alsace-Lorraine. And one of the reasons why Dreyfus was suspected and convicted falsely of treason is because he was really situated in the middle of that French political schizophrenia. He was victimized in that way. And at the time of Dreyfus, France divided into two parties: the Dreyfusards, including Léon Blum's family, who supported Dreyfus, and the anti-Dreyfusards, who opposed him. And long story short, in the French national election of 1898, the single issue on the ballot, or the main issue on the ballot, I should say, was Dreyfus. Was his trial a travesty? Okay. Now, Léon Blum witnessed that. He was part of that, not only the trial itself, but the political campaign that followed. He was a Dreyfusard. He supported Dreyfus. Eventually, the Dreyfusards won the election. Dreyfus was brought back. He was retried. He was acquitted. He was promoted. And around the same time, we have the completion of the separation of religion and state in France in 1904. Léon Blum was part of all that. Now, his reaction to that politically is interesting, because this is not the point where he becomes a leftist or a socialist. In the aftermath of the Dreyfus Affair, Léon Blum becomes an anarchist. Now, when we think of anarchists, we think of crazy people throwing bombs. That's not the kind of anarchist Léon Blum was.
They're always spherical, right, and have a little wick at the top.
Exactly. He wasn't blowing things up.
Right.
His notion of it was a more moderate notion of anarchy. He basically believed that the state should not be involved in the lives of the individual. He believed in complete individual rights. He was sort of like a civil libertarian times 1,000. Okay, so. That was initially, but eventually he came to see the bankruptcy of that, and he gravitated towards social democracy. And by 1914, he is emerging as a leader of the French Social Democratic Party. Now, here's where I think it gets very interesting. Okay, let me say a couple more words, all right? First of all, by the 1920s, if you want to get an idea of who Léon Blum was, he was the 1920s French Jewish equivalent of Bernie Sanders. He was the leader of the French Social Democrats. The things he advocated for: a shorter work week, income equality, health care for everyone, paid vacation. These were ideas that really didn't exist. Remember, this is the moment when what we now call as the welfare state is coming into being.
Right.
And Léon Blum was critical not only of the French right wing, but also classic French liberalism, which believed that the government shouldn't intervene in, let's say, the economy. You know, Léon Blum advocated similar kinds of things. Now, in the 1930s, Europe is immersed in an economic depression, including as well as the United States. Governments are collapsing, and something very interesting happens in France. All of its neighbors, or many of its neighbors, Germany, Italy, Austria, Hungary, Poland, they're gravitating to the right. You have democratic regimes being replaced by fascist regimes. France is the one country that until the end of the 1930s is able to resist that tendency. In France, politics moves from the centrist liberals to social democrats. The social democrats, they are the main response and the most successful response to the Great Depression. It's as if Bernie Sanders was elected, or his party became the dominant party in the country. And as a result, the French economy, French society was able to avoid the worst difficulties of the Great Depression through much of the 1930s.
But then there was an invasion.
And now, just before the invasion, the invasion comes in 1939.
Yes.
In 1938, there's another election. Léon Blum, all he is just a leading voice. There's a kind of kind of inner conflict within the Social Democratic Party. They can't agree on who should be the best coalition leader. In 1938, Léon Blum is named the leader of the Social Democrats, who win the most seats in the parliament. He becomes Prime Minister of France, and through his guidance, he puts a lot of his aims into practice. So in the film, you'll hear Jean Reichenbach saying to people in defense of Léon Blum, you may not like him, but he's the reason why you get paid vacation. You may not like him, but he's the reason why your life is better. And he becomes that symbol of what France can be. And during the difficulties of the 1930s, Léon Blum becomes a symbol not only that France can withstand the Depression without becoming a fascist country, but he becomes a symbol of why social democracy is a preferred course to fascism. Now, all of this comes toppling down. At the end of 1939, France is defeated very quickly by Nazi Germany in the war, and Léon Blum's government is replaced by a puppet regime, or let's call it an allied regime, called Vichy France and the Vichy regime. This is a right-wing French fascist regime. And that's the point of departure of this movie. And leaders like Léon Blum are either expelled or they're in prison. Some of them are put into prison camps right away. Léon Blum is able, what his challenge in this film, and what his mistress is going to help him do, is to navigate the difficulty of how much he's going to be villainized by this.
Right. I mean, there's so many tightropes that are walked through the movie that at a certain point, there's a scene that takes place near Buchenwald, and he's in a little house. And how can that be? How can it be that he wasn't just invited across the street? Those things are if you just walk into the film at a certain point and you see things, you'd say, there's something wrong here. But this was, in fact, an amazing kind of circuitous path that he took.
Well, tightrope is a great analogy, Elliot, because there's a gap, or there's a step between Léon Blum and the Nazis themselves, and that's the French fascists. French fascists, yes, they were allied with Nazi fascists, and they could be very brutal, but there was this lingering respect for French politicians all the way across the spectrum. They believed that French politicians should not be subject to the same humiliation as, let's say, ordinary prisoners of war and ordinary people who are subject to Nazi persecution. And they also, and this is maybe the more important one, most members of the Vichy regime, at least until a certain point, were willing to differentiate when dealing with Jews, differentiated between Jews who were not French. For example, Jews who had immigrated to France from Germany and especially from Poland, versus Jews who were native-born French Jews who were acculturated French-speaking. The more French you were and the longer you had been in France, the more protection and the more assistance, let's put assistance in air quotes, you could expect from not the top officials of the Vichy regime, because officially they were going along with what Hitler wanted to do, but from lower level officials, from middle and lower level officials, they would treat French political prisoners and native-born French people, French Jews, differently.
And in Germany, you saw nothing like that. They were all grouped into you can't tell me that you're a German first and a Jew second. It doesn't work that way. This is what you are, and you're out of here.
But until a certain point in the film, Léon Blum was not. He's definitely a prisoner, but he certainly isn't in a Nazi prison camp, and he's not in a Nazi forced labor camp. Léon Blum, he is not subject to a lot of the worst excesses until later. And when he is eventually sent, he's sent to Buchenwald. Now, I'm not going to say that Buchenwald was a picnic. It was not. It was a concentration camp. But it was a preferred destination some French Jews were sent to death camps, and Léon Blum was not. So, not to diminish it, he's not being treated nicely, but he's being treated less harshly, less demonically than others because of his particular station. Now, that was helped by the fact that his mistress, she came from a French family which was wealthy and which was connected. And also, she knew how to work a room. This is the part of the movie, in fact, the actual one was significantly younger than the actress who plays her. So that's fine. We can leave that aside. But what the movie, I think, captures is that this is not only a courageous woman, but this is a savvy woman.
Yeah.
She knows how to deal with officials. She knows how to get what she wants. And she uses not only her connections, but she uses her femininity. She uses her Frenchness, her knowledge of French culture. She knows how to talk to officials. She speaks the language of government, of culture, and there's a remarkable scene where she's staying at the inn near where Léon Blum was incarcerated, and this French singer begins to sing this song, and there's an objection to it, and she is the one who settles down the room.
Takes control. Yeah.
She is just loaded with charisma, which makes her, a remarkably good counterpart to him. There's a reason why these two really were drawn to each other. They have an inner strength, an inner charisma, and an ability to deal with severely adverse conditions and to figure out how to navigate them, how to negotiate them, and ultimately a little bit how to mitigate them.
Right.
It's one of the reasons why this story didn't go much. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, in addition to the romantic aspect, she appears to be almost acting as a manager.
A publicist.
Right.
She's really she's his spokesperson. And she is the one who's going to intervene on his behalf, and she is going to use every connection. She is ruthless in a good sense of the term.
Right. And is this the way it was?
She can bring. She knows her limitations. She also knows which officials to talk to. You'll notice at no point in this film do you see her talking to an official who is wearing a swastika.
Right. Because
they weren't listening. They didn't care. That whole preferential treatment to French politicians and French Jews who are indigenous. Nazis, Nazi officials themselves stationed in France, they didn't care. Now,
was her role made more theatrical in terms of what we see on screen than she actually was? What do we know about her?
Yeah, I think
there
might be the difference between being dynamic and being theatrical.
Right.
So some of those scenes might be exaggerated for effect, but this is a strong woman. This is a person who knows how to be forceful without losing her cool. Mm-hmm. She is firm. She is forceful, and she gets what she wants. And I think what's very interesting is that she gets what she wants not only with officials. She gets what she wants with the people around her, and I mean this in the very best sense. Her husband, Reichenbach, she tells him flat out, and this is true, when they got married, she says, "I'm still in love with Léon Blum. I'm going to marry you, but I'm not relinquishing my feelings or my connection or my support for Léon Blum." That's not ending. That is going on. Now, critics of the period will say that's a mark of French decadence. But in this case, these are two individuals who are engaging on a political journey together, trying to save not only themselves but those around them. But she has that strength with her husbands, with her son, with Léon Blum's daughter. That is true. That's really, really who she was. And I think to the extent that comes across in the film, it's remarkable. It does her credit because his personality was very different. He was the ultimate. We would call him the ultimate policy wonk. He was brilliant. He was the quintessential intellectual. His charisma derived from him being able to explain things with a kind of erudition that most people, and even most French politicians, certainly didn't have.
There's a slight parallel in terms of the film and the way they're portrayed that reminds you a little bit of the Victor Laszlo character in Casablanca, and how Ingrid Bergman was sort of taking care of him in the film, including the final decisions that she made. And I think it was probably a conscious choice that there would be a couple of characters at the center of the story who were somewhat familiar to moviegoers, and it felt a little bit crafted toward that in terms of the way the story is told. Maybe it was just me.
No, it's a great point. I think that she is drawn to Léon Blum for the same reason that Ingmar Bergman, whose name in the movie I can't remember her name, Ilsa, maybe, whatever her name in the movie was. Yep. The same reason she's drawn to Victor Laszlo. I mean, she is drawn to his brilliance. She is drawn to his genius. She is drawn to his charisma, his leadership.
And his
But-
necessity. Yeah.
Yeah, yes, but his commanding presence did not derive from, he wasn't a fire and brimstone speaker. In fact, he was
Right.
kind of, he was sort of more prosaic in the way he talked. But what he said, what he wrote was absolutely remarkable. I mean, he could explain complex ideas to ordinary people. I mean, he explained things that the analog that leaps to me, the more to everyone, is the way Bill Clinton used to explain things and the way people could understand. But Léon Blum's program during the 1930s, it really, the parallel to the United States, it's Bernie Sanders now, but it's FDR and the New Deal. The success of the New Deal in the 30s here and the success of Léon Blum's party in the 1930s to get in a parallel kind of way, they're able to withstand fascism in each country. And there's almost a kind of gratitude or appreciation by people in France for Léon Blum, for, sparing us this country, imploding into fascism, and credit goes to that party. And short of a military defeat, I mean, they probably could have withstood. But he's a remarkable man, and she's a remarkable comrade, a remarkable companion to this remarkable man.
Right.
And their mutual devotion to each other is truly remarkable. Also, they each have their own family, but they recognized in each other a true complement. Something they complemented each other in that way. Neither one was using the other. This was sharing a certain aim together. And, in reality, it's hard to separate their romantic love for each other from their camaraderie, their political camaraderie that they shared. I think for the two of them, it was inseparable. It was all sort of wound up in one bundle.
Exactly. One seems like a natural outgrowth of the other. So tell us what happened to Léon Blum.
What happened to Léon Blum? I mean, I'm just blanking on the end. I'm just blanking for a moment. Let me just think about this. I wrote down a note here. Okay, and let me just. I just want to give. Yes, he survived the war. After the war, he was able to live for almost another decade. He doesn't die until 1950. Okay, once the war ends. Léon Blum is he returns to French politics. He returns to a position of administration. He's prime minister just briefly in the post-war government. He tried what we would say in modern terms or in contemporary terms. He was an advocate of bipartisanship in post-war France. He tried to bring the center left and the center right together. Yeah. Okay, in order, particularly after the war, to make sure France didn't become communist. And as much as he was opposed to the fascists, he had a tenuous relationship with the French Communist Party during the 1930s of necessity. When the war was over, though, Léon Blum was very suspicious of Stalin, and he wanted to resist France going in that direction. So, in a sense, he steers France clear of fascism during the 1930s. But then he steers France clear of communism during the 1940s, okay? But he remains a kind of figure through the 1940s. By that point, he's not really the main figure anymore, but he's sort of a symbol. And he becomes a symbol, first of all, of France's resistance, both actual resistance and political resistance to fascism. But remember, he's also a French Jew who has survived the Holocaust. And in post-war France, there's a kind of reckoning with the Vichy government. Post-war France has to say, how much did ordinary rank and file French people enable Hitler and Nazism to do what they did to French Jews? And for those who are trying to, there's no denying it, but those who are trying maybe minimize it or to diminish it, they can say, well, Léon Blum survived the war. Léon Blum, he didn't run away from France. He remained committed. And that's really the ultimate, that's really the denouement, the climax of his life is after all of that, when everything settles, when the war ends, with everything that France was during the war, it was still his home when the war ended. He he still loved France. He considered himself a Frenchman of the Jewish persuasion to the day he died. He considered anti-Semitism in France, and he considered any kind of bigotry or discrimination as the anomaly and not the rule. He continued to the day he died to believe in the values of the French Republic, but also to believe that French Jews would always be joined in their struggle against persecution by like-minded French people. So the same way that Dreyfus was supported by Émile Zola, and Zola and Léon Blum during the 1930s, he found many allies, many of whom were not Jewish. They were united politically, and other believers in those values all the way through the 1950s as well.
Yeah.
All the way through the 1950s.
I think it's the kind of conclusion that the filmmaker Marcel Ophuls wanted to come to. He made his great documentary, The Sorrow and the Pity, in Clermont-Ferrand, which is referred to in this film. And just hearing the name reminds you of his Sorrow and the Pity, which was a portrait of a town under the occupation, which was the subtitle of the film. And he's kind of spent his life researching the subject of what causes people to join with the wrong side, regardless of their previous values. And he's unsparing, and yet, a great, humane, extraordinary person who remained very French, extremely French. So it's a struggle that I know that he always waged, and it must be not unique to Léon Blum.
Yeah, I mean that's what he symbolized. He's not your typical French Jew. In fact, he's highly atypical. He's exceptional in so many ways, but in some ways he really represents the essence of not only what it meant to be Jewish in France, but how Jews were seen by many people in France, what Jews symbolized, not that they're being there, and that how citizenship, if it didn't include citizenship for everyone, even for groups that once had been marginal elements in French society, it was meaningless. In other words, you couldn't have some people who were more equal than others. If everyone wasn't equal, no one was truly equal, and that's what Léon Blum came to symbolize. And the fact that
no, go ahead.
No, the fact that he was a Jewish prime minister of France on the eve of France being conquered by the Nazis, the power of that symbolism. France had reached this moment that's going to be disrupted unnaturally by an unnatural movement of Hitler and Nazism and fascism. It symbolized a lot.
Is his influence seen in France today?
Oh, I think definitely. I mean, in many ways, the French left, the French center left, someone like Emmanuel Macron sees himself as almost an heir of Léon Blum. I mean, he represents many of the same values, and the conversation, what Léon Blum represents, for some in France, it points to the fact that Léon Blum came from a family that 50 years before he became prime minister were basically a marginal element of Jews from Alsace who are on the margins of French society, and he rose to such prominence and made such a contribution that France would be certainly less well off. French society would be something less without the Léon Blums and the Reichenbachs and these French Jews who made this contribution. And so now the legacy is the question that's being asked is, what about other marginalized groups? Today in France, when they look at, for example, this influx of Muslims who are today, they're really the marginal element of France. The same kind of question is being asked in terms of the same question, the same set of ideas. So today in France, the ideas of that original French Revolution and French republicanism that were once asked vis-a-vis with respect to French Jews are now being asked with respect to other groups as well. So when there are French people who, when they look in this Muslim immigrant community, they have to wonder, within that community, is there another Léon Blum somewhere? Is there another Reichenbach family? Are there individuals or groups or a whole community that's going to make a dramatic contribution to French society. Now, by the same token, that opposition to Jews that once defined France during the time of the Dreyfus Affair and at the end of the 1930s, those French people who went along with Vichy and went along with persecuting Jews, that same mentality is now manifesting itself in terms of another kind of xenophobia, another kind of discrimination. So yes, I think in that sense, Léon Blum is very much there. You don't have people quoting him all the time, well, directly anyway, but the same ideas he was fighting for, his specific policy ideas and his broader vision of France as an inclusive country, as a place where a tapestry of people can live together with the same rights and the same opportunities and the same possibilities, that same camaraderie, which is going to be, let's say, fostered by French culture and the French language. And French people, they really do believe that a person who's reared in the French language and French culture is going to be ultimately embrace these French Republican values. It's just a matter of time, and those who don't are sort of an anomaly. Yes, both are there. So, you know, someone like Macron is a descendant of Léon Blum. Someone like, Marine Le Pen, she's a descendant of the opponent or the critics of Léon Blum. It's the same debate in certain ways.
So in 2021, is Léon Blum well known in France? Is he taught in school to kids? Do people know the name?
People know the name. What's interesting and what really varies is how much is Léon Blum taught, how incidental is the fact that he was Jewish. And he is this leader of the French left, this social democrat, this policymaker, this Dreyfusard, but he is taught more as a French political leader than he is as a French Jewish, as a French Jewish leader. His Jewishness has become more incidental, and this is why I think the analogy, the same way that the fact of Bernie Sanders being Jewish is incidental to many people.
And what do you think? Why is that incidental? Is it that anti-Semitism is receding? I don't feel that necessarily. Although I wasn't alive during this.
Critics of Bernie Sanders like to see him as an example of, you know, how Jews are going to usher in some kind of communism or something like that. Yeah. But for the supporters of Bernie Sanders, what I mean by the fact that he's Jewish is incidental, it's his policies they're focusing on. He's helping ordinary people, and in the helping of ordinary people, those kinds of notions of discrimination, well, anti-Semitism certainly, not that it's not there, but it becomes almost secondary to these more immediate concerns. So Bernie Sanders is not saying, he's not advocating his policies in the name of some sort of Jewish ethic. He never mentions it. And Léon Blum,
he doesn't mention it. He in effect, kind of makes himself a figure who's just not interested, not only in the subject, but in being asked about the subject.
Because Bernie Sanders, and this is what he and Léon Blum have in common, they both regarded one's religious identity as entirely a private, not a public matter. So
didn't World War II make it apparent that to some degree Jews had no choice over whether it was private or public? If you said, I don't consider myself Jewish, it really didn't matter. You were put on transport to your death.
I would say yes and no. In terms of how Jews are seen, World War II and the Holocaust and Nazism introduced a situation where, regardless of whether a Jew wanted his or her Jewishness to be private or public, it didn't matter. It was defined. You were defined by others. But after World War II, there was a return to this. One of the anti-Nazi notions was that an individual gets to define himself.
We have the right to define ourselves. Yes, that would be great.
Religion becomes private again.
Right.
And imposing or defining externally one's religious identity or pigeonholing someone in some ways, that's something that Hitler does. That's something that Nazism does.
But is there a line between defining your own persona, presenting yourself, and passing and hiding it? I mention this because recently I had a discussion with someone in a similar setting, talking about the British filmmaker Mike Leigh, who told me personally when I met him back in like a little before no, it must have been around 2000, that he only recently came out. And I said, "Oh, what do you mean?" He said, "As Jewish." He said, "I've been covering up consciously, but not consciously, my Jewish identity to make the films that I make, to make the deals that I make, to do what I do, and defined myself as being just a secular person." And he said, that he felt in his own heart of hearts, his beliefs, that he was a secular human being, but said to deny my Jewishness now seems crazy to me. And he said he's not running around making films about the subject, but he no longer shies away from it and says, "Well, I'm what I decide I'm going to be." I'm only asking in that there's something kind of utopian about the idea of I am this, I am X. I mean, we're living in an era when we're seeing a resurgence of extremism and fascism.
Absolutely.
And people who are defining others in ways that they can't defend by saying, that's racism. And they will say to you, "Yeah, you want to make something out of it?"
Well, you're right.
So,
The ability to decide for oneself who one is, that only works in a tolerant society. When there is a surge of intolerance, it's more difficult to do. Absolutely. And you mentioned the filmmaker Mike Leigh. We could say the same thing about Steven Spielberg, who made movies that had nothing to do with anything Jewish, till he decided he was going to make more Jewish films, beginning with Schindler's List and whatever. But for someone like Bernie Sanders or Léon Blum, the world they wanted to live in, and yes, there's a almost utopian element to it. The ideal world and society they each envisioned was a society in which, if I, Bernie Sanders, or if I, Léon Blum, it's up to me how Jewish I am going to be,
right,
whether or not the fact that I'm Jewish is something private or public or incidental or central. It's an individual decision. That was a core value of the French Republic for all people. And in some ways, in France, Jews, the Jewish ability to do that, to have that choice, was a measure of the vitality of French republicanism.
right. All right. I'm only noticing, this is why I'm a terrible host. I'm only noticing that we've got a load of questions coming in from the public, and enough of mine. But let me just go to a couple of these, Howard. Somebody wants to know about Blum's upbringing, his Jewish upbringing specifically. How was he raised?
I would say he was raised with, he lived in an acculturated French Jewish household, which means there was a little bit Jewish and a lot French. So he knew the basic ABCs of Jewish. I'll put it this way. He was more Jewish than Theodore Herzl was raised, okay, but not much more. If you had asked him growing up to define himself, being Jewish was probably second to being French. So I wouldn't say he was an assimilated Jew, because he definitely had a Jewish identity and a connection to the Jewish community, but he was a highly acculturated Jew. He was much more interested, let's say, in reading Baudelaire than he was in studying the Talmud or reading Maimonides or something like that. Yep. Philosophy for him did not mean Maimonides. It meant Diderot, something French. And like many French Jews of his time, he became very French.
Also, along those lines, a question from someone who wants to know if you could say something about the Riom trial, where Blum was accused of treason.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The big question about that is, was it a real trial or was it a show trial?
Right.
And there you have that tension between the French officials involved. They really ideally wanted it to be a real trial, because they know they're going to have to live with the aftermath. Any Nazi influence involved was just a show trial. But the fact that, and we don't really, it was a mixture of both. There were elements of it that was real. There were elements of it that was rigged. And historians have been trying to sort of flesh out in what kind it was. And it really almost depends who you ask, or which part of the trial transcript you read, or how much you judge the outcome by, you try the trial by the outcome. In fact, though, this is a mishmash. It was a hybrid of both. There were elements of it that were real. There were elements of it that were rigged. The fact is, he wasn't executed at the end of it, which itself shows if it was completely rigged, he would have been brought out and tortured and killed. or sent to a place where he would have died of forced labor, certainly at his age. But that's not what happened. So, it's that tension, that balance between French officials who want him to be treated differently than ordinary victims of Nazi occupation versus Nazi officials who didn't care. The ones he dealt with more directly, these were Frenchmen. Even there's one scene in the movie where his mistress goes to Pierre Laval, who was one of the leaders of the Vichy regime, and Laval actually, I wouldn't say he acts with any kind of compassion, but he doesn't inflict the worst possible sentence. And someone who gets less than the worst is actually doing pretty well in Vichy.
In that world, yeah. And along similar lines, another question. A viewer wants to know if there's any truth to the idea that Blum was kept alive by the Nazis at the end of the war to possibly serve for a prisoner exchange.
Absolutely. A part of Nazi strategy, Nazi tactics, especially once the war was going badly. There was a point after which more and more Nazi officials began to realize that they weren't definitely going to win. Right. And there was certainly a point where they were probably going to lose, so they needed some leverage. So yes, Léon Blum was just one of a number of individuals who are being kept almost as a hostage. In the worst case as a hostage, in the best case as a bargaining tool, for sure.
Yeah, a question from Judy Lobel. When he was prime minister, is there any documentation about anti-Semitism directed at him by the French?
Most anti-Semitism in France at the end of the 1930s, in other words, before the Nazis came, wasn't directed at Jews like Léon Blum. It was directed almost exclusively or overwhelmingly, I would say, primarily at foreign Jews, Jewish immigrants. It was more in the realm of xenophobia. It was akin to most anti-Semitism in America was directed at Eastern European Jewish immigrants, as opposed to, wasn't directed at, acculturated, assimilated Jewish families. So
what about immigrants from other countries?
I mean, Jewish immigrants from other countries?
Not just Jewish, but other immigrants were there.
Yeah, I mean, there was a general xenophobia in France. There was a notion, especially during the Depression, that common xenophobia is driven partly by French nationalism, but also by economic concerns where these immigrants are going to displace French workers. There's economic concern for jobs, which Léon Blum's Social Democratic Party was mitigated by creating more jobs, by having government invest during the Depression in more government-sponsored works, which was creating more jobs, so it was diminished. But yes, there's a general xenophobia. But make no mistake, the xenophobia manifesting as anti-Semitism was the harshest version of it. Jewish immigrants are singled out as the worst of immigrants, especially those from Eastern Europe.
Yeah. I was just going to say, going back to the movie itself for a second, just asking you as, let's say, you're a film critic or you're a film producer, looking at this film, which has Léon Blum at its center, who do you think the target audience for the movie is? Is it the French audience learning about events that they didn't know about, or the French audience learning about how events that they had heard of actually unfolded, the intricacy of it? Was it conceived as a kind of historical thriller? Was it designed for export to show the rest of the world this individual and introduce this person? Or is it a prestige production that was designed to nourish and also in some way prettify the events of the day? Not to say that it was blood free, but it was more in the historical epic than it was in the down and dirty, here's how we did it mode. I'm curious as to who you think the film
it's a great question, and I'm no filmmaker, so I'm going to answer as a 100% amateur. I don't really know nothing, but if I had to guess, I would say the film, its original intention was to be made as a love story. The romance between these two, that part of the film I think is kind of flat. I wasn't that drawn to their relationship. I guess it was nice and all, but I think beyond that's first. But beyond that, I think this film is, I wouldn't necessarily say prettifying, but I would say celebrating a moment. It's really sort of saying that, contra the notion that the French people simply caved in to an invasion and gave up so soon, and Vichy was a sort of inevitability. There was this fighting spirit in France. Right. Léon Blum embodied a willingness. He could have run away. He had multiple opportunities to escape. He didn't. He stood and fought. So he's sort of the non-military counterpart to someone like Charles de Gaulle, who fought, who was the lead, and the French resistance, that heroic French resistance, which French people love to celebrate. So I think this movie was intended for that audience. Was it intended for export? That I couldn't say. I mean, I think without having some background as to who Léon Blum was, I think it's difficult to appreciate why this movie is that terribly, I mean, why would this woman be interested in this guy? And he wasn't, he wasn't that dynamic. He wasn't that terribly interesting. He was simply an important politician. You have to know who Léon Blum is, but French people know Léon Blum the way we know FDR. Right? They're similar figures in French and American history.
Okay. And here's someone who does want to know about the relationship between Jean Reichenbach and Blum, pointing out that she was very, very young when they met.
Right. She was 16.
Not in the film necessarily, but yeah.
Yeah. 16? In reality, she was 16 when she first was just smitten by him. I think the film stayed away from that because, 16-year-old girl and a much older man these days.
Heroic figure.
This isn't going to fly. That part of the movie wouldn't work in the age of #MeToo. It just would be kind of icky. We don't really, but in French society,
maybe it was. Yeah.
It was okay. It's something very aristocratic almost, where love conquers all and age shouldn't matter. And in France, 16 is the age of majority, not 18. So, but they made her a little older. I think partly because of the actor they wanted to use. Right. If they had found someone younger, they might have done it. But so I think that's just more of a coincidence.
Can you talk a little bit about the effect of the Spanish Civil War?
Great question, and
it came in from Rabbi Oded. Yeah,
the Spanish Civil War in 1937. This is sort of a prelude to World War II in the sense that Spain, there's this war between fascists and communists, and the countries of Europe are kind of lining up to whose side you're going to defend, and countries did take sides. Léon Blum, in his leadership role, he kept France out of that conflict. That's the importance for this film. Is he did not want to see France supporting either side in that war. He didn't want France drawn into the war. He didn't think it was that significant for France to be involved, although he recognized the significance of the conflict himself. And so when that was over, he was demonized as being passive, as being cowardly, as not mustering the ability of France to support. In retrospect, when we look at that moment, whatever France had entered the war, and it wouldn't have really made much difference in the outcome. But Léon Blum chose the non-heroic path. He was the ultimate pragmatist. He would reason out a situation. What is the most practical course of action for what's best for France, the French economy? Is France going to be devastated by a certain outcome? And he reasoned no. And in 1937, 1938, remember, before World War II and before the Nazi invasion, without the benefit of hindsight, in other words, there's no reason to second guess his choice. It made perfect sense. Now, a year later, there are going to be those who said that Hitler was emboldened by the fact that there wasn't more intervention against the Spanish fascists.
Let's see. We both are fading in and out, and I'm not absolutely sure why. So maybe we should soon wrap up. But I think you're here now, so please go ahead.
No,
you were talking about Hitler.
Basically, there were those who said that claimed that Hitler was emboldened by the outcome of the Spanish Civil War, and it made him more willing to strike because there wasn't a mass mobilization on one side against the Spanish fascists.
What was his attitude towards Stalin during the war in terms of pragmatism? Was that the same driving force?
Yeah, I mean, in the 1930s, like many social democrats, he was wary of communism, but he saw Stalin as your typical communist. And during the war, this is simply a question of politics makes strange bedfellows. Once the war was over, he was among those he's the ones who saw what Stalin really was, and he became an anti-Stalinist, and he used Stalin as his way of saying the agenda of the communists has sort of missed the mark. And that's why he gravitated more toward the center in this alliance of center left and center right to steer clear not only of fascism, but also of Stalinism. He was someone who drew the line between communism in its classic sense, which had its benefits, and Stalinism, which really had degenerated into authoritarianism.
And so that was relatively soon after the war ended.
Even during the war. I mean, by the end of the war, Stalin in his posturing is already starting to sound and look a lot different. You know? Even in the late 1930s, when Stalin begins to purge his own general staff for lack of loyalty, people like Léon Blum, they begin to notice, whoa, that was unusual. That doesn't seem very democratic. That smacks of authoritarianism. But they didn't fully understand what Stalin really was until toward the end of the war, by 44, 45, and then after the war.
Yeah. I think we're sort of at the end of our questions. We're pretty much at the end of our time as well. I want to thank you, Howard, for being here and illuminating this film for us. And if Jamie's out there, I wonder if you've got any questions. And Judy, you're here too. Everybody's around.
It was a great discussion. You answered my question. Actually, you answered both my questions about his background and the anti-Semitism question. So I think everybody enjoyed the discussion. It was very smart and gave us a great historical context about somebody that, and in fact, I don't think you answered the question somebody asked. Did you answer this? Are there memorials to Blum?
No, I didn't get to that one. I apologize.
Yeah.
Are there?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question.
There are small memorials. There's no grand memorial. He's someone who is remembered in a more local and a smaller way, as opposed to, in a grand way. So, much of the grandiosity, let's say, especially of Paris, those spots have already been taken by heroes of French history. And by the same token, he's not remembered in the way that Dreyfus was remembered. In some ways, he's seen as sort of a product of Dreyfus, or a child, a political child of the Dreyfus movement. But there are some, but there are smaller ones. I mean, But
we've heard about Dreyfus in Hebrew school. We never heard about Blum.
Right, Dreyfus is an anti-Semitism story. Léon Blum is a politics story.
Right.
And today still the story. One of the reasons is it doesn't fit that. It's not quite a Holocaust story. It's not quite an anti-Semitism story, and it's not a Zionism story. So, what box is it going to fall in Hebrew school? So that's
great Jews that you could write a book report about.
We talk about our own. We talk about Brandeis instead of Léon Blum.
Right.
He's the progressive.
The question: do the Jewish kids in France talk about him? That's the real question.
Well, they learn about him. All school children learn about Léon Blum when they learn French history. The same way we learn about FDR here. They learn about Léon Blum there. Now, in many French textbooks, like I said, the fact that he's Jewish is incidental. In the same way that the fact that Roosevelt was Protestant is incidental, or Kennedy was Catholic was incidental. He is the leader of the French left and the last bastion, or the last attempt to keep fascism out. That's how he's remembered.
And lest we forget, we've been talking a lot about Léon Blum. We've certainly talked some about Jean Reichenbach, but the film is named for her. It's called An Irrepressible Woman, in case you are looking for a movie with Blum in the title, and you want to see this movie. An Irrepressible Woman is the film that we've been talking about, and Jean Reichenbach is the woman at the center of the discussion that we have been somewhat talking around, but very much to the point about the life and the works of Léon Blum. Anyway, Judy, back to you.
Yeah, thank you. And, as always with Film Festival, we try to bring out different aspects of the film. Sometimes it's concentrating on the the film and the attributes or the questions about the filmmaking. And in this case, we had a chance to look at a historical, which is always a challenge in film festival. There's often very few true historical films. So I'm really happy that we were able to feature this one and this discussion. So Howard and Elliot, thank you so much. We really appreciate your expertise, your wisdom. Our next film discussion is tomorrow night, Thursday, May 13th, when Gary Duncan, the subject of A Crime on the Bayou, discusses his life and legacy of the Supreme Court case. He will be joined by Margot Schlanger from University of Michigan School of Law. And I know that's going to be a fantastic discussion. I highly encourage you to come back for that. Remember to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and visit our website listed on the screen, culturalarts.jccdet.org, Film Festival, for all the info on all films and live events. Please tell your friends if you enjoyed this or any of our discussions to go on to our website to hear these. We'd like to have lots and lots and lots of viewers, and have a great night.